Ukrainian foreign minister recently said that North Korea is a more effective partner for Russia than the West is for Ukraine. What's happening, in your opinion, right now in terms of the support that goes from the West to Ukraine?
What the Ukrainian leaders have to do is sort of evoke these, these old scare tactics like citing North Korea supplying Russia. I'm not sure how much Russia needs supplies from North Korea. It's been really good with its own production of weapons, certainly for this war. It's doing a lot better than the West is doing. The West has run out practically. And Zelensky et al. And the others, they see that that funding, future funding, at least for the United States, is really in jeopardy. Republicans are reluctant to send more money to Ukraine when our open border to the south of us is calling for attention. I think what's going to happen is that the United States is going to look to Europe, to NATO and the EU to pick up where the United States can no longer fund these wars. And you're hearing this from Europe too. You know, they're basically at the beck and call of the United States. And what's the name of this operation that got going on? I've written it down here. Operation Steadfast Defender, which is a NATO new operation to continue funding Ukraine to keep this war going. And so, you know, when Ukraine complains about North Korea supplying Russia, I mean, my gosh, I mean, what's the is that taking the high moral ground when they're getting all their funding from the West? And I don't know that, like I said earlier, that Russia's that dependent on funding from North Korea or anybody really. It's doing really well with its own production.
You talk about the arms production in Russia. We have two systems fighting each other in this conflict in Ukraine. The Russian military-industrial complex versus the United States military-industrial complex. In your opinion, why they were so efficient in providing ammunition to the front line?
There are a number of things going on here. Our military-industrial complex has changed over the years. It's just another aspect of our hugely unhinged capitalistic system, which demands funding from Congress, public funding, taxpayer dollars, and what have you. And yeah, for the latest new weapon, and how good that weapon is in modern warfare, who knows? So far, they've not been that great in Ukraine, and we've come out of wars with much different kinds of enemies, with Iraq and Afghanistan. Going back to Libya, even Vietnam, you know, we're fighting sort of insurgencies, we're fighting guerrilla warfare, those kinds of things, and well, not necessarily Iraq, but with a much weaker opponent. Here you've got Russia, which has been preparing for this for a number of years. I mean, Russia's been on alert for more than a decade as to something's going to happen between Russia and the West. They've seen the behavior in 2014 when the West backed an overthrow the pro-Russian elected government and installed a puppet, and they've seen how the West broke the Minsk Accords, the Minsk agreements, and so they've been preparing, and they've had warnings, and so they've been ready for this. Even though I think in the initial days of the special military operation, Russia maybe underestimated some of the difficulties that were ahead, and led to some mistakes or whatever. But they've learned quickly, and they've just really had a lot more time to prepare for this. And the West, I don't know. We've also, you know, stretched ourselves thin. My gosh, we're fighting fronts now, and either through proxy or through a lot of saber rattling. Look, we're talking about possible war with China, with North Korea, with Iran, with Russia. I mean, how many fronts can we afford to arm and to fund those armaments? And so I think that's why Russia's been a lot more concentrated. Now Russia too has we've pushed our so-called enemies. I've never thought of them as enemies, but we're supposed to think of them that way, of Russia and China and even Iran together, where they're in partnership now. And so now you have them, yes, and even North Korea possibly, and sharing resources and so forth. But They've had an advantage of forethought, which we're not that good at anymore.
When you look at Europe right now, in Germany and in the United Kingdom, they're talking about fighting Russia. Europeans go to war with Russia. In your opinion, why they're thinking this way?
You got several things going on here. You got Joe Biden up for re-election, and he's got a tough campaign ahead because Donald Trump has now won Iowa and New Hampshire. It looks like Donald Trump is going to be the Republican opponent, whether he's in jail or still fighting indictments. He's got his base, and his polls are up. Joe Biden's polls are way down, way down. So Joe Biden, he can't allow a loss to Russia between now and November. After November, who knows? But it's got to keep going. Republicans don't want to continue funding. They don't want his $60 billion going toward Ukraine. They see that's a waste of time, a waste of money. And so he sees that funding in jeopardy. Ukraine is on its knees. It needs funding from somewhere if it's going to continue this war, which it's already lost. It's lost this war, but if it's going to continue, at least a semblance of war, it's got to have funding. So who does he turn to? He turns to NATO. They are just puppets to the United States. They do the United States bidding, and the people who run NATO, and largely the leaders of many of the major European countries, Schultz and Germany and so forth, they pretty much listen to, they obey whatever Washington says. So he's telling them behind the scenes, now you're going to have to pick up. And so that's why I've talked about this program, this steadfast defender and so forth, where NATO's talking big. What is NATO going to do? How much can NATO produce? They helped the United States arm what in February 2022 was probably the best army in Europe, which were the Ukrainians. And look what the Ukrainians did. They've lost this war to Russia. So what can NATO do that the Ukrainians were not able to do, even if they're joined together? So it's an exercise in futility, I think. Besides, the leaders of NATO and the European countries are losing the backing of their own citizens. Look at the huge farmer protests in Germany going on right now. Protests against cutbacks in social programs, fuel subsidies and so forth in Germany in order to fund the military industrial complex of NATO and to fund this Ukraine thing. And you had protests last year in France. France, all it takes is a little disgruntlement. They're out there on the streets protesting. And I think the British economy is suffering gravely, as are many other countries in Europe. And so they're losing the backing of their people, even as they rattle those sabers louder. I have good friends in Poland. I was in Poland a number of times doing reportage and writing and so forth. They just heard from this past week of how you've got a new government in Poland, and with new restrictions on public media there, that's causing widespread protest and there. So you've got a lot of unrest across Europe, and so whatever people in Brussels are saying is not necessarily reflecting what the people on the streets in Europe are saying.
How do you find Poland right now? If you remember when this war started, they were so radical in supporting Ukraine and going even to war with Russia.
I may have told this story before, but I was in Poland some years back, and I was traveling from I think Warsaw to Bratislava, Slovakia. And I was on a train, and it was at nighttime. I was trying to learn a little bit of Polish, but I spoke a little bit of Russian. So I was trying to speak Russian to some people on the train, asking some advice for something. And they just looked at me, and just stared at me and just walked away. So I told my friends in Łódź, Poland, where they lived, about this story. And my friend Ala said, Ala Gadomski, she said, Joe, don't speak Russian in Poland. We don't want to hear Russian in Poland. So there is a long sort of a history of animosity toward Russia and Poland, and understandably. But at the same time, you've got all these refugees that have come from Ukraine, mostly settling in Poland. That's put strain on their system there. You've had some political unrest within Poland itself as to its own sort of role within the EU. There's been disgruntlement from EU toward Polish policies and what have you. And so there's division within Poland, and now that division is beginning to sort of emerge about this war in Ukraine. They don't like the Russians any better, but they're also, I think there's a growing discontent, as there is elsewhere in Europe, toward this sort of Ukrainian experience that's not working too well.
You said that Biden, for his political agenda in the United States, he's trying to continue this war in Ukraine. If this conflict continues until November and December 2024, it seems that Odessa and Nikolaev and these cities that are now Ukrainian would turn Russian. If Russia takes Odessa and Nikolaev, it's so difficult to take it back. But it doesn't seem that the Biden administration taking this into consideration. They just want to continue this war.
Well, Ukraine has lost the Donbass. It's lost Crimea. It's not getting those places back. Those are not coming back. Russia is not going to give up territory that is now declared part of Russia. And you mentioned Odessa. Odessa is still a possibility, and Nikolaev, but perhaps two. I don't know, but for certainly Odessa. Who knows what's going on in the military boardrooms in Moscow as they're planning the future. They've achieved basically their initial goals of basically freeing the Russian-speaking people of the Donbass as much as possible from the tyrants in Kiev that were bombing them and killing as many as, I think, 14,000 or 15,000 between 2014 and 2022. And so they've got that, you know, there's still conflict on the front lines. Of course there is. Whether Russia wants to claim more territory, I don't know. I'm not sure anyone knows, but I'll tell you what, they're not going to give up what they have claimed. The Western media calls this a stalemate. It's not a stalemate. It's a loss from Ukraine. Ukraine has lost these territories. These were the main stated goals of Russia in coming into the special military operation, to make sure the Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine are no longer harassed and bombed and killed by the Ukrainian government. And I think by and large, other than the ongoing, battles and struggles that are taking place, on the front lines and what have you, they've basically secured at least that area for Russia and not Ukraine.
When the United States was trying to get out of Afghanistan, they were negotiating with Taliban for years to see how they can get out of Afghanistan and what's the best way to do that. And right now in Ukraine, it seems that the situation is getting out of control for the Biden administration and whoever comes after the Biden administration. Within the Zelensky administration, we have these differences between Zelensky and Zelensky. He tried to dismiss Zelensky. Do you see any sort of hope that the Biden administration can control this administration?
Well, you've got a Biden administration which is not that well grounded in reality anyway. I mean, they came in thinking that Russia was going to basically fall apart. They pushed through this, basically pushed Russia into this conflict. And then they got the conflict thinking they could win it fairly easily. Russia would be defeated or Putin would be overthrown. And then they can march on in and split Russia up and then allow the big Wall Street to come in and take over all those amazing resources that Russia has. Well, that didn't work out. And now they see, they've got to see that this war is lost as it's standing right now. But they're trying these different things. You talked about Zelensky and Zelensky. Okay, you've got this apparent divide that's between the political leader and the military leader. There's talk now of Budanov, I guess, who's sort of a special ops expert within the administration over there, possibly being the next leader once they push Zelensky aside, and he would be more willing to work with the West and whatever the West wants. So who knows? It's the palace politics, palace intrigue over there is fascinating, and what's going to come out of that, I don't know. But they're thinking all kinds of different options, and but none of them are going to work because, as I've said, the war is already lost. All they can do is sort of keep the semblance of a war going, where it seems there's still a possibility, there's still hope. There is no more hope. And they've got to sort of keep that sort of fantasy alive, I guess, for the next 10 months. And after that, all bets are off.
Antony Blinken was talking about what's the Russian goal in Ukraine. He said that the main goal of Russia is to subsume Ukraine, all of Ukraine, and then march toward Europe. Did the European buy this type of rhetoric at that moment? And how do you see the situation right now?
My gosh, it reminds me of David Halberstam's book about the Kennedy administration, the best and the brightest, and all the ways the best and the brightest, the best and the brightest who came from Harvard and Yale and Princeton, how often they screwed up. And you would think that they would have done better. Here you've got Blinken and these others creating these fantasy stories, and whether, they've got their people in power in Europe and in NATO. Whether they actually believe what they say, it makes you wonder. What does Russia even want with Western Ukraine? Western Ukraine does not like Russia. It's Ukrainian. It speaks Ukrainian. It's not a Russian sort of, all of Ukraine in some ways is connected to Russia, obviously to Russian history and culture and so forth and so on. But to control all of Ukraine means a constant vigilance on the part of Russia to maintain that control, as would it be further into Europe. There's been no indication at all of that kind of sort of ambition on the part of Putin. Putin at one time actually floated the idea of Russia becoming part of NATO. And he envisioned some sort of a Western sort of alliance that could possibly work after the fall of communism. Well, we totally rejected that. Bill Clinton's administration sort of led the charge there to sort of break every promise that had ever been made to Russia, and let's move eastward and take over as much as we can. Let's the West take as much as we can while Russia is weak and can't do a darn thing about it. And so, no, these are just, I've got to believe that in their heart of hearts and in their closed door meetings, they know Russia had no ambition to move further than really probably than eastern Ukraine, with any sort of real effort to sort of gather territory and expand a so-called empire. But they can't say that, because in any kind of war situation, you've got to demonize the other. The other is a devil. It's a Satan. It's a horrible monster that has to be controlled. So you've got to sort of build a story about that monster and that monster's ambitions so that everybody feels scared and threatened. And that's how you get your way. And that's what they're doing.
Do they really care about Ukraine?
The United States, at least its government and the West, Europe, they don't care about the Ukrainian people. All of this was a tactic to weaken Russia and to sort of ultimately lay claim to some of the resources that Wall Street and major industrialists have been wanting for a long time. What was going on here is that the West has to sort of build this fantasy of a Russian aggressor that wants to take over the world, much like Germany in World War II and so forth and so on. And to do that, they've got to spin these tales. And too, what's going on here too, as well as in the Middle East, is you've got wars run by politicians. The politicians are making the big decisions. Ukraine had met with the Ukrainian leaders had met with Russian leaders not long after the initial sort of confrontation between those two countries, and worked out a deal that would have avoided this war. But here, Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom comes flying in, probably at the orders of Washington, D.C., to say, no, you cannot negotiate. You can beat these guys because we're going to help you. They wanted war. Even though at the potential destruction of Ukraine, which is what they've got, an entire generation of Ukrainian men practically gone. Ukraine, and who knows, and beyond that population too. And so that showed a blatant disregard of the Ukrainian people for a political agenda, for a political motive.
When this conflict started in the Red Sea, we all thought that Saudi Arabia and UAE going to be part of this operation, since they were fighting Houthis for years. They didn't go along with Washington's policy in the Red Sea. On the other side, that was a huge change on the part of Europeans. Germany and France were not willing to be part of this operation. How do you see the situation, their policy right now in the Red Sea?
Well, Saudi Arabia fought with Yemen for years, fought the Houthis for years, and did not win that war. Basically, the Houthis are still there. All this bombing of Houthi headquarters and alleged headquarters and bases in Yemen. They're not showing any results. Joe Biden has already admitted that. The Houthi attacks on shipping across through the Red Sea and everything is having an effect. It is reduced trade there quite a bit, and and sort of this thing it has branched out from the conflict that's going on in Gaza. Of course, you don't have in Europe the obsessive support and focus on Israel that you have in the United States. That connection between Israel and the United States, goes back to 1948. We inherited what the British had and took over sort of that role as protectorate in many ways of Israel. We fund their war machine or help fund it. You don't have that kind of sort of visceral attachment in Europe. In fact, much more sympathy toward Palestinians and the Palestinian cause that has been raging for decades now. And so that's why you have a reluctance there and a kind of a divide between the United States and Europe, which is kind of amazing given what's going on in Ukraine, and that they can actually disagree on something. And so you got that going on. It's much more complex. This whole thing with, as I said earlier, you got politicians running these wars. You got Netanyahu in Israel, who's scared to death. Once this war ends, he's out. He may be in prison. His support is down to like, double digits, or maybe 15% or something like that among Israeli people. And so he's got to keep this thing going until he can maybe show some sort of victory or what have you. But it's not going that well, is it? I mean, this thing is dragging on for months and months, and he still has not defeated Hamas. And then you've got it, as you were mentioning, name breaking out everywhere, elsewhere too, in the Red Sea, and then on the border with Lebanon, with Hezbollah. And so this can really explode into a major war, which none of us want, except perhaps Victoria Nuland and some of the neocons and Joe Biden's administration, who've been wanting war with Iran for years and years, and now they have their opportunity. But I tell you, Iran's no just pushover either. I mean, it's really interesting what's going on with Iran. Hitting these bases in Syria, in Iraq, and also in Pakistan. And what it's doing is, and I'm not the first one to bring this up, but that it's letting the United States know you're not going to be funding these terrorist groups, working with terrorist groups that ultimately are working to undermine Iran. That's the CIA, and what he's kind of sending a message. They're sending a message to the CIA. We're not going to put up with that. We're not going to just stand back and allow this to happen. And so there's things going on behind the scenes that our media is not reporting, and so you're seeing some resistance from Iran to just allowing the U.S. and its allies in Israel to just sort of have their way. So you're getting resistance there, and now also look at the last last year or two, where you've had a China brokered arrangement, I guess, with Saudi Arabia and Iran. Amazing diplomatic breakthrough. When have we brought countries together, other than uniting NATO to fight a war with Russia? And so you've got this sort of relationship change between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they're all Muslims, seeing what's being the affliction that's being brought upon the Palestinian people. And so that's a very complicated situation. So the U.S. shouldn't be surprised that its allies are not sort of readily lining up behind it in their support of Israel.
When it comes to the Biden administration and their reaction to this sort of policy in Gaza, it seems that they're not having some sort of upper hand when it comes to Israel. They cannot force them to go after some sort of negotiation, some sort of political settlement in Gaza. In your opinion, why the Biden administration was not capable of doing that?
To do that would go against the grain of who Joe Biden is. He has spent his entire career as a stalwart supporter of Israel. That's part of his DNA. There's something about himself he can't change. The only reason he's even encouraging Netanyahu to back off a little bit is because he's reading his polls. He's reading his polls are down. The young people who are part of his sort of coalition that got him elected, they're breaking away from him because they don't want what's happening to the Gazan people in Gaza. And so he's facing a strong candidate in Donald Trump. He's losing his base of support, even among Black voters and what have you. The strongest constituencies for him are disgusted with what Israel is doing in Gaza and really ethnic cleansing an entire people. Not to excuse what Hamas did to the Israelis when they first attacked, but at the same time, that doesn't justify going back and just basically wiping an entire people out. And so Biden is seeing this. So that's why he's trying to sort of nudge Netanyahu in the right direction. But Netanyahu is a hardcore right wing who's got even more hardcore right wingers in his administration. There's his national security minister, Ben Gvir. There's finance minister Smotrich and defense minister Gallant. These guys come out of a long tradition of really hardcore radical Zionism with roots in terrorist attacks going back to the 1940s. They come out of that sort of school of thought of Zionism, which is basically, I think, in my own opinion, a kind of a superiority of the Jewish people to all of those around them, and a kind of a nationalism that justifies any kind of sort of treatment of the Palestinian or Muslim people. And so, and basically they are the core of Netanyahu's base. And so he can't, in one sense, he can't back off because they'll turn against him. And so but I don't know that he wants to come back off because that's who Netanyahu is. And there's always been a kind of an arrogance in Netanyahu too. No matter what Israel does, the United States is going to support it. He's expressed that many times. It doesn't matter what we do, the US is going to back us up. And now he's got this horror. Now the world is seeing what the Israeli military is capable of doing finally, because it's been doing things like this for a long time, but now it's in full view of the world. The worldview of Israel is never going to be the same. It's never going to be the same after this. But even in the middle of this, in this horrible, and in one level, public relations disaster for the nation of Israel, Netanyahu and his hardcore team are not going to back off, and they don't give a damn what Joe Biden is suggesting that they do, because they're going to see this through, and unless there's some sort of a event that takes place that's going to force them to change their minds, but I don't see that happening right now.
Here you have Russia, China, they're talking about the same solution. In Europe, in the United States, everybody's talking about two-state solution. And on the other hand, the Netanyahu administration is not willing to do that.
Yeah, Netanyahu has been on record for years opposing a two-state solution. And he thinks that a two-state solution essentially is allowing an anti-Israeli, potentially terrorist nation to be on Israel's borders. At least that's sort of the rhetoric he would give us. But a two-state solution has been the idea that's been floated around through the UN, through the US, through Russia, much of the world for decades now. And ultimately, I think it's going to, if anything, perhaps this war has resurrected that idea, which it kind of, the idea sort of drifted off into sort of sleep status or something in recent years. Nobody really talking about it, but now it's back into the discussion. I'm probably not in agreement with a lot of my colleagues whom I do agree with on most things, but I see a rationale for the presence of Israel where it is. They have ancestral roots there too, as well as the Palestinian people. But when Israel was created, with the great assistance of Great Britain and many broken promises by Britain to the Palestinian people, I think as many as 400 Palestinian villages were just emptied of their residents so that Israel could move in and begin to build its country. Many people, hundreds of thousands of people dislocated back then in 1948. And so that issue has never been resolved. Okay, there's going to have to be acknowledgement of both sides for a right to exist in my mind, and then a creation of a two-state solution that allows for, at least at some future date, some sort of semblance of peace between those two nations. But it seems like we're a long way from that right now, and we're never going to get that as long as Netanyahu is in the leadership role in Israel.
You look at Israel right now, we have Likud party, and we don't have any alternative for this party and Netanyahu. Why the United States and the presidents of the United States from both sides, Republican and Democrats, didn't try to help these oppositions, these alternatives to get stronger in Israel?
You go back decades. I've mentioned this in a previous visit, with to Jimmy Carter in the 1970s, who was able to bring Menachem Begin together with Anwar Sadat of Egypt. And Menachem Begin, who himself came out of a terrorist background, bombing the King David Hotel in Jerusalem back in the 1940s and so forth, bringing those two together, my gosh. And so there was a strong effort there to bring some sort of reconciliation and some sort of hope for a future of peace in the Middle East. Well, over the years, that has just deteriorated. You've had, in the interim, what has happened too? We've had wars in Iraq, we've had wars in Afghanistan. We had, terrorist groups, Al Qaeda, ISIS, and so forth. Radical, extremist Islamist groups that have also fed into the animosity and the hatred that exist on both sides. And now we've gotten into a situation where we can barely talk to each other. We're a long way from where Carter was with Begin and Sadat. And how do we get back there again? Naomi, your question assumes that we have a diplomatic corps in Washington that knows what they're doing. And I don't see a whole lot of diplomacy. Where are we achieving diplomatic ends in the world other than just creating war? And here you've got China bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together. Where can we point to that we've done something like that in recent years? I think the tragedy is, and I really believe this, that unhinged capitalism is destroying my own nation, the United States, and threatening the world, because it's the military-industrial complex that Dwight D. Eisenhower warned us about, and he was part of himself, but he saw it as he was leaving his presidency and warned America about it. It has now taken control of both parties, Republican and Democratic Party. And we have now been feeding this war machine for decades, endless wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And now the promise of another endless war that could involve Iran, and who knows, Russia, China, what have you. And to feed that machine, to feed it. And it's awful. It's immoral. And look at the devastation that's left behind. Why do we even listen to the neocons like Victoria Nuland, Undersecretary of State, Blinken, even Biden and others who have promoted these wars? Look at the record. Look at their record. Failure in Vietnam, failure in Afghanistan, failure in Iraq, failure in Libya. We've left a bloody mess everywhere. Hundreds of thousands of millions of people have died, many millions, and environmental disaster. And after 10 years or so, what do? We just walk away. We walk away from Iraq, we walk away from Afghanistan, and leave the mess behind us. Who can say that's not going to happen again and again? And I'm not sure that the neocons care, because in the meantime, we've enriched the Raytheons, the Lockhart, Martins, and other firms that are part of this military-industrial complex. We've enriched those guys, and that's ultimately perhaps the goal to begin with.
The other thing that comes out of this conflict in Gaza and in the Red Sea is this new rhetoric of bombing Iran. And This is going to be a disaster. Nobody knows what's going to happen after that if they start doing this.
Yeah, when Biden came in, he saw himself as another Franklin Roosevelt, an older guy, who comes in, he's going to have this massive social program and be pro-labor and so forth. I think a lot of it was more talk than reality. And, Roosevelt was a wartime president. Maybe he has sort of envisioned himself. And now when he brought a final end to the war in Afghanistan, I was encouraged. I said, oh my gosh, Joe Biden has finally ended this horrible war. I'm sure that the people in the head honchos in the military industrial complex said, hey, wait a minute, you can't be doing this. We're gonna have to find us another war to fight here, because you got to keep feeding us. Netanyahu and many in Israel in his ilk in Israel have wanted a war with Iran for a long time. They feel like Iran itself is a threat to Israeli existence, and they wanted this war. They would love to see somehow this conflict in Gaza be pushed into a broader war that includes Iran and finally take Iran out. Taking Iran out is not going to be so easy. Iran is a huge country. We've been rattling sabers at Iran for a long time. Do you think they've not been preparing for that? Trump took us out of the nuclear accords with Iran. And so we're not really sure where they are now in their nuclear developments and so on. And now we've pushed Iran into a corner with Russia and China. And so now we've seen them allied with one another, I guess possibly North Korea. So that war is not going to be just with Iran. It's not going to be like Iraq, which was bad enough, or Afghanistan. We fight for a decade and still can't come out claiming victory. So it's another huge, long, drawn out, bloody mess that's not going to end up bringing about any kind of solution that might be promised by Washington, D.C. And it's like I said, it's immoral. It's all about, to me, it's about money. It's about big business. It's about sort of a chess game on that. Hopefully, it's going to keep the United States hegemony over the world. Look at it was just yesterday we were rattling sabers at China, wasn't it? And then we were looking ahead toward a war with China, and then I think I wrote about this recently in a piece that. Xi from Chinese leader Xi gets invited to San Francisco, so he and Joe Biden can kind of sort of meet and sort of calm things down a little bit, about Taiwan and so on. And I can almost imagine a sort of a closed door conversation in which Joe Biden says, "Look, we got our hands full. Let's you and me sort of try to get along at least for a while I'm taking care of these other issues, and then we'll get back to our problems." Because how many fronts can we fight? And so you've got these people within the Biden administration who I think they want war. I think that's part of their nature. And you would hope that our elected president, that our leader would think about the world as a whole, about the American people who are sick of war, and think about them and what they want, rather than what some sort of special interest behind the scenes want.
When you look at the situation right now in the Middle East, we have two sides, Russia and China, and United States and NATO. Who's winning these countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE?
Well, you've got the development of the BRICS, alignment countries, including Brazil, China, Russia, others, and which are challenging, as I said, the sort of Western hegemony over the world. They're challenging the US dollar. Eventually, it could be that the dollar is no longer the world standard, monetary standard. And that's going to have a huge effect on the American economy whenever that happens. You've got these countries that are now seeing, in one sense, and I'm speaking here from the heart of America to say that, the American sort of day in the sun seems to be shadows are forming over that day. And this is what Putin has talked about many times. They sort of a multipolar world in which you've got a world in which you've got different powers, yes, different major powers, but coexisting and not feeling like one has to be dominant over the others, and only a one power world, in which you've got others, but then essentially working together, perhaps to bring the rest of the world up with it. I've talked about this before, Neiman. Look at what when China goes abroad into other countries, what is it doing? It's building dams, it's building bridges, it's building infrastructure, it's building positive things for those countries to help them in their economically and so on. What do we build? We build military bases and then try to stir up trouble with our out of control CIA for, I'm not sure what the ultimate interests are in a lot of the trouble we create around the world. And it's such a sort of a break with the promise that the United States has held over the centuries to many in the world, many of the immigrants who came here looking at this shining sort of a ship of freedom that they can sort of live their lives in to their full potential and escape the tyrannies in their homelands. You know, it's still you know, I think a dream of many immigrants who come here, that part of America still exists, but it's not being sort of demonstrated in the actions of our political leaders, who become so beholden to their financial supporters that those financial sort of supporters are who they look to and who they want, whose ideas are they promoting in the public sphere, not the ideas and the desires and the wants of the American people.
We've seen that in Slovakia, Fico and Orban in Hungary. Even we had a right wing in Netherlands, a new leader in Netherlands who's totally against this war in Ukraine. Do you see these changes happening on and on in Europe, especially when it comes to Germany, because Germany is kind of the foundation of the European Union's economy?
Good gosh, when you think about Germany, I'm half German. My mother was German, and I studied in Germany. I lived there for a number of years. I have many friends over there and relatives still, and so I have a close connection to Germany. For that nation's leaders to allow Germany to deindustrialize at the behest of the United States, you know, before the war in Ukraine began, I think one of the goals, it was a stated goal, perhaps not that publicly, but of people in Washington, D.C., to sort of rein in Germany and its growing economy. Certainly its dependence on cheap oil and gas from Russia, which was at the heart of that strong economy. To break that connection there. And ultimately, I think they did when they destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline. And so what did that mean for Germany? They're paying multiple times for their energy now from the United States and elsewhere, instead of to Russia, where they had a great deal. And now it's having its effects on the German economy. Companies are leaving that country to move elsewhere. The farmers are protesting en masse. And a part of that protest, this farmer protest, is against the war in Ukraine. And you know, but it's interesting. The American media is not reporting very much about this protest at all. There's a huge protest, thousands and thousands of people in the streets, and with huge support from the German people, according to polls, who are just disgusted. There's turmoil within the German political sphere. New parties emerging that are trying to challenge the existing parties. And Schultz, I think, is on the way out. I think he's going to be history soon because he has been a total puppet of Joe Biden and the West. And one reason that NATO and the EU, NATO being the sort of the military wing of EU in many ways, they want to keep this war going because once the war ends, Nima, once it ends, and the people of the European countries look at that war and says, what was this all about? Why did we get into this war? Who got us into this war? And what purpose were they serving? They're going to see the corruption, the sort of mishandling of what and destruction that could have been spared, all the lives that could have been spared. And boy, I'll tell you, this is going to be the end of the public careers of a lot of people, a lot of politicians now ruling those countries. And perhaps some of them are going to end up in jail as well. Who knows? And I'll tell you, that's why they've got their own interest in keeping this thing going, much like Joe Biden does, at least for a while yet, until they can find an exit for themselves and a safe exit.
in your opinion, Donald Trump gonna win 2024?
Well, this is interesting for me I'm an old political reporter. I was in DC a number of years covering politics, and to see the games that are being played right now. And but what I am seeing too, okay, first of all, let's look at the Democratic Party. I believe Bill Clinton and subsequently Hillary Clinton really in many ways destroyed the modern Democratic Party. Today's Democratic Party is not the Democratic Party of the 1930s that helped the rise of the American labor movement and worker justice in this country after the Great Depression in the 1920s. This is not the Democratic Party that helped push and support the civil rights movement in the 1960s that went on to envision the Great Society of Lyndon Baines Johnson. This is a Democratic Party that Bill Clinton came in the 1990s and says, we're going to have a third way. We're going to have a third way that's going to sort of incorporate the basic Wall Street capitalism, big capitalism of the Republican Party, but it's also going to embrace certain social issues from a so-called liberal stance. Issues that sound good on the surface, racial rights, LGBT, minorities, gender rights, and so forth. All those things are worthy. Of course, they are worthy and with value, but they're not ultimately cost Wall Street anything. They're not going to take from their profit levels. And so this is how Clinton envisioned the party. He envisioned a party that would win elections. And in the process, it lost its heart. It lost its connection to the people as a whole. It emphasizes differences, not what unites us. It tells you, you are Black, you are white, you are a female, you are male, you are gay, you are not gay. All these things and that divide us and say, we're going to support you, we're going to support blah, blah, blah. And they're not really supporting the people as a whole. And what unites us, let's talk about what brings us together. Yes, we have those differences, but ultimately what do we share and what do we want as a people as a whole, as American people? The Democratic Party lost sight of that. That's why, of all things, many in the working class in the United States, which so stalwartly supported Franklin Roosevelt on up into, at least into the 70s and what have you, or at least certainly up until the mid 60s, perhaps, with the student protests, which began to alienate many working class people. But certainly the working class was Democratic almost by instinct. No longer. They've gone to the Republican Party, which was the initial party of Wall Street, and which still is in many ways. But the Republican Party has taken up those same social issues and say we're anti-abortion. We don't want excessive rights for LGBT or what have you that undermine the rights of other people, of everybody. So they've kind of sort of claimed that ground. But ultimately, they're not going to do anything for the working people either, for the working class. That's why huge numbers of voters may not like Donald Trump, his personality. He's loud, he's a braggart, he's full of ego. But at least he was challenging the system that has evolved in this country, this uniparty system that's beholden to powerful monetary interest rather than to the people. At least he might shake things up. And that's why the deep state that Donald Trump attacked so many times, and which really does exist and cuts across party lines. The deep state doesn't want Trump. Trump's a capitalist. Trump's a supporter of Israel. He's not, in some ways, he's not all that radical, but he's also kind of a wild card. And they can't predict him all the time like they could of Joe Biden. And so that's why they don't want him. That's why Donald Trump scares the hell out of Washington, D.C. Nima, it's kind of like what happened in Argentina. I spent some time in Argentina. I have a special interest in that country. I've written about it. And who do they have now as their leader? Milei, who's vice president, Villeneuve, I think is her name. She actually is sort of giving it out to the horrible military junta that ruled that country between 1976 and 1983 and saying maybe those guys weren't so bad after all. And here's Milei basically saying he wants to dollarize, the economy in Argentina. He wants to end social programs, privatize everything. He's basically, he's basically pushing the agenda of the neoliberals, neoconservatives in Washington and elsewhere. Why do people vote for a clown like that, which is what he is? It's desperation, because both the left and the right in the traditional parties, even the Peronists, who have good intentions in Argentina, but they've not followed through on it. And you have this horrible inflation, whatever. So the Argentine people voted for this, whom I think is a crackpot. At least he may shake things up, and who knows? It's a venture into the unknown. There was a little bit of that element in Trump, and I think that's why you have this dynamic going on right now in both countries. And we're going to see what comes out. I don't know that Trump's going to do anything that's going to radically change things. I do think he might end the war in Ukraine, and I think that he has said as much. And so that's one good thing that Joe Biden is so far not delivering on. And but he's also a very strong supporter of Israel. So I don't know. It's going to be a very interesting political year, but I'm really concerned about the outcome of what's going to happen. You've got these alternative candidates. You've got RFK, as you mentioned, and others, and they're going to make a difference. Such much like Ross Perot and others, Ralph Nader have done in the past. Who they hurt more, Trump or Biden? I'm not exactly sure right now. And so, but it's going to be a tumultuous election. That's what's going to happen between now and November. But I'm not sure we're going to be any better off after it's over with. And that's what kind of worries me.